Hello, everyone. Welcome to an episode with Julian Baggini, who is the best-selling author of How the World Thinks. Julian proves that being a philosopher and being a bestseller are not dichotomous. They are both possible at once. He's done it twice, at least twice, and for good reason. He explains philosophical ideas in a very readable way and presents them in frames and with references that a wide audience can understand, but a philosopher can read and also get something out of, no matter how much you've studied. Julian is also the founder of the Philosophers magazine, and he's one of those guys you hear on BBC in our time quite often, if you happen to listen to that, which I do. I met him way back, I don't even know why, somewhere in London, and we've kept in contact every now and then over the years. He's just a good philosophical mentor and someone who's one of the rare people who's been able to remain a philosopher and do good philosophy while at the same time bringing philosophy to a wider audience. And you'll hear that in the conversation because we talk about a lot of, heavy-ish subjects, but they don't feel heavy at all. We talk about, for example, this relational versus kind of atomistic way of looking at the world in philosophy and in science and so on. And he talks about how this book sort of have changed his perspective a bit in terms of the relationality. But, in so doing, we talk about some really deep things in a way about how the people that we meet and even the people that we read become such deep parts of us, and the line or lack of a line of where that begins and ends in terms of life and death, and how patterns of being or patterns of thought might be similar in terms of this effect. He reminds me too that even though we do have our own unique spatiotemporal paths in the world, that doesn't necessarily mean that we all have different truths, or that we shouldn't still think of truth as a social, shared, ongoing, dynamic reality, which is, constantly needing us to question one another. There's something he says about respecting the capacity of the reasoner, and about respect. Often we think we shouldn't challenge one another, or we shouldn't say when we disagree that that's not a sign of respect. But in a sense, what he's kind of saying at some part in the conversation is that actually it is a sign of respect to do that. It's more about where you're coming from when you're doing it. And that's something that philosophy does for us. And he does write a lot about that, the ability to think differently and to be able to handle being questioned, but also to know when you're in the space for that, and to trust one another, and open up a way of letting that be a safe space. So there's so much here, and he offers some really beautiful, quite gorgeous example really of holding the paradox, which is one of those themes I talk about a lot. Towards the end we get into that. I don't think we get into map and territory here as I usually do with everyone, but we get into a lot of really important subjects related to either ors and dichotomies. And he also, at the end, we talk a little bit about, for you young philosophers out there, about life decisions and what's possible and life balance. So there's a lot in here, and it was great to talk to him today. Or no, I didn't talk to him today. I talked to him many months ago. It usually takes me like a month or 2 months before I post the conversations, by the way. And a lot of them I had before I even started this channel. So just so you know, some of these conversations happened a long time ago. And actually, it's good I say that, because in this one, I think I'm wearing a sweater. So it was in the winter, and it's definitely not winter now. It's been really hot these past few days, but beautiful and sunny. And I hope you're having a good summer out there, wherever you are, and that we can all do something together to make more and more summers more and more beautiful. All right, that was a little too idealistic even for me, but in any case, I am glad you're here, and thanks for spending a little time with us. And here's Julian. Hi, Julian. It's so good to see you. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you for inviting me, Andrea.
So I want to start with this book. Congratulations, by the way. How the World Thinks.
Thank you.
It's a bestseller. Is that your third bestseller?
No, no, it's a second actually. I mean,
Oh, the second.
two's enough, yeah. But there's a big gap between this and the first because the first was the pig that wants to be eaten, which was about 2003 or something. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah, yeah.
I was just remembering your first book, or at least the first one I read, and How We Met, which was a really long time ago. And it was also had thinks in the title, right? It had like an apple on the cover. How to Think Like a
Oh,
Philosopher, or
no,
no?
that's the most
No, that's the recent
recent
one.
one.
How a Philosopher Thinks.
What philosophers think? Yeah,
What
what
Philosophers
philosophers
Think.
think?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, the
exactly.
other
Yeah,
one I have back here, which is the newest one, which might
yeah.
become a bestseller too. You never know.
Well, we live in hope.
So I just want to start with, maybe it's a little bit of an annoying question. I'm sorry if it is, but you can tell me. But when we talk about how the world thinks, we're talking
Mm.
about the human world, right? In this
Yes.
book. Yeah.
Yes, we are. Yeah, yeah. No, no, it's not an annoying question. It's something that I guess people assume to be the case. They don't even ask the question.
Well, these days, sometimes, there's all these ideas about plant cognition, animal cognition, and a lot of our neuroscience classes these days, those are entire classes. So that's kind of why I wondered if you'd even like considered that or
Oh
just
yeah.
crack at that.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, you sort of the title. I hadn't really thought how the title could be interpreted in a different way to mean, how Gaia thinks, I guess, No, I wanted to do a book on global philosophy, and global philosophy is a human artifact. So I didn't even wasn't even on my agenda to think about
Yeah.
plants or other how other animals think.
Well, that makes sense because philosophy is a human endeavor.
Yeah.
But so what made you want to do this? I mean, this is a quite a big adventure you went on. It sounds like you're not really in the book, but you are in the book, kind of in the background. We can tell that, and you say it at the beginning a bit that you did travel. So I wonder where this idea came for this
Yeah.
book.
Well, I think sometimes I've come to the conclusion perhaps that sometimes the most interesting books are not the ones where the author is setting out all that they know. It's rather where the author is trying to find out something
Mhm.
and shares that voyage of discovery, shall we say, with the reader. Because, I've been writing about philosophy. I've been doing philosophy really all my adult life. But when you do philosophy and you've been educated in a British university, you are doing Western philosophy, full stop. And non-Western philosophy is not necessarily explicitly disparaged, but it's seen as something else. It's different. It's just whatever it is, it's not what we do. I think there is often also a belief that it is not really philosophy, right? And it's more, I don't know, cultural thought, religious thought, whatever it might be. And, over the years, of course, I've been aware of non-Western philosophy and I do talks, and sometimes people ask me why I don't know more about it. And I think my comfort with knowing so little about it was decreasing. And I thought that I was persuaded that I really ought to know more. And I mean, actually, I can think of some particular prompts. Perhaps the prompt which was perhaps the straw that broke the camel's back. Perhaps I don't know. I'm not sure about the chronology of this. There's an article written by Brian Van Norden and his colleague. I apologize to the colleagues, I'm terrible at remembering names.
I'll try to
Uh,
find it.
yeah. And it was really sort of saying, yeah, they'd been trying for years to get people to teach more non-Western philosophy, and they went through all the reasons why people said they didn't, etc. And they said, okay, look, we give up, but at least from now on, have the honesty, call yourself the Department of Western Philosophy. At least do that, just be clear about it.
Hmm.
And but their explanation of why, the unconvincing replies people gave as to why they shouldn't bother, they did seem unconvincing. So I thought, listen, I need to find out more. And actually, you then look around and you see that there really was not a book, not a single book, I think, which was aimed at the general reader, which was trying to be global, had sort of depth, but wasn't, which was accessible. The nearest book I could come up with is David Cooper wrote a very, very good book on world philosophies, but it was very long. It is accessible, but it was, pretty academic in style and tone. So it's like this book is needed and I need to read it. So in order to read it, I have to write it. So that's the long answer to your question. Yeah.
Well, those are usually the best books, the ones we need to read, and so we write. And obviously, a lot of people were interested in this. It came at the right time. And I think we've all noticed that there's been all of us who keep track of philosophy or do philosophy or just read philosophy that it has changed lately to where people want to open up beyond what is usually called this kind of Western canon. But in your book, there's a lot of tension in doing that, isn't there? Because in a way, the whole idea, the word philosophy, sort of in the way you assume it's human, we just almost assume these particular parameters. So from where we are, from our position, it can be kind of hard, can't it, to understand where something like religion and philosophy can be distinguished, if they even need to be distinguished. I remember in school, I was always interested in what is Eastern philosophy, but I had to study it in the religious department.
Yeah.
And of course, you go into this a lot in your book. So was that a hard part of writing this book, or was that an interesting part, both?
Yeah, well, no, it was an interesting part. I think it's difficult. I mean, it's what's very interesting about philosophy. One of the many things about interesting things about philosophy is that there isn't a straightforward answer to what it is. So, if you ask a philosopher what is philosophy, and you'll get very different answers, and often you'll get a bit of fumbling around and not really doing much. I remember there's one, I can't remember one of the 20th century sort of British philosophers who, when asked the question, what is philosophy about, he simply gestured to his bookshelves. It says, it is what all these are about, which was not a very helpful definition. So I think it's pretty clear that lots of things, particularly human endeavors and artifacts, that they don't have some essence which is pure and untainted. So we may overuse Wittgenstein's idea of this family resemblance concept. In other words, we use the same word for something because it has sufficient things in common for it to make sense. Um, and I think that when you look at philosophy, well, the thing is, if you look at philosophy within the Western tradition over its, over 2,000 years, there's a lot of variety within it too. So it's not like you can say anything clear about philosophy which will make it clear that it makes it very different to non-Western philosophy. So, for example, the big one is people say, oh, well, the thing about philosophy is that it's not a religious, it's independent from religion. That's just historically inaccurate, right? I mean, people will study Augustine and that's sort of like explicitly religious. Descartes was explicitly religious, Kierkegaard was explicitly religious. So the idea that there is this sharp dividing line doesn't make sense either. So I think, you have to kind of nevertheless make decisions about what you include and you don't include. Well, I think if I'm asked what philosophy is, the answer I used to give for a long time was that it's a combination of a set of questions and ways of answering them. So the kind of questions it deals with are the kind of questions which are not straightforwardly answerable simply by accumulation of more facts, right? So how far is the Earth from the moon? Go measure it. Now, we didn't know how to measure it for a long time, but it's an empirical question. We know that. What is good? What is justice? Well, you can't just go out and measure that. You could do an anthropological or historical survey about what people have taken justice to be, but that's not doing philosophy as such. So we have all these questions which are, if you like, left over by the special sciences or particularly empirical disciplines. But then the way you answer them, I think, is important. It is important that philosophy is defined by its commitment to reason. Now, there's a big story about that. But all that means is that, if you answer those questions by appeal simply to religious authority or perhaps some insight you claim to have had through some spiritual experience or something, or just by what your tradition says, you're not doing philosophy. Now, of course, what makes reason is itself another concept which is contested. I wrote a whole book about that too, which is called The Edge of Reason. But I think that the key thing about reason is that it has a certain kind of openness and intersubjectivity, if you like, that if I offer a reason for something, it is something which you have the capacity yourself to understand and to assess and to test and so forth. That's what makes it rational. If I give you a reason which is somehow it's not possible for you to either understand it or test it or interrogate it, then I'm not really giving you a reason in that strong sense of rationality. And if you understand that, then it seems very clear that in all the major non-Western traditions, there is something which is called philosophy. They will have different views about exactly what is within the domain of reason. They will have different views about the way faith and so forth fits into it, but that's okay because it's within a framework where that is itself justified by reason. Okay. So, for example, in what we now call Indian philosophy, to describe the philosophy of that part of the world, there is a certain status given to what might be called insight, and sort of what even called revelation. But the point is that that's within a framework whereby that kind of understanding has a rational justification. So you can reject the justification, and there are some schools of Indian philosophy which did and claimed that wasn't a valid source of knowledge. But it's not just you're not just told to accept it as a valid source of knowledge and then get on with it. You're given arguments why it's a valid source of knowledge. And of course, in Western philosophy, again, we have examples of things like that, whereby people will claim that, for example, the apprehending what is good is something that we can't give further reasons for. We have to just do it directly, and they'll have reasons for that. So there are plenty of examples in Western philosophy where it's claimed that for particular kinds of knowing, you can't rely on a rational argument, but there is a rational argument why you have to use that way of knowing. I'm
Yeah,
afraid I'm
this
giving a
gets
very
to a lot
long,
of,
convoluted
yeah.
answers. Yeah.
No, but that's part of why doing philosophy is important in a way, and also what I like about this book and what I want to get into, or both the books actually, the newest one too. But I think it might be in the newest one, How to Think Like a Philosopher, where you talk about philosophy almost as like a practice,
Mm.
or critical thinking itself as being something, as being a practice. Or I've always thought of critical thinking as being, I wish we all had to learn how to do it, because it's hard, as you say also in your books. It takes work, it's challenging, but there's something about the practice of it that, I mean, you point this out in your latest book, that, it really helps like your quality of life, but also just connecting and all these other bigger themes that you talk about. And you also talk about philosophy as being something, philosophers are distinguished by not having a safety net or something, I think too. It's kind of this place where we can try out things, investigate, and try to develop some sort of rigor, I guess. But as I hear you talking, and just to come back to this book about how the world thinks, you start at the beginning saying there's something that all these, because you talk about really the world, that's very new about this book, looking at philosophies of the world, which is very hard, but you somehow do it. But you start at the beginning saying there's this kind of through line where everything is one, ends up being a kind of message that we get in Greek and Indian and Chinese in various philosophies. But that, as we get into the book, we realize it's really quite complicated, right? Mostly for how this critical thinking and so on. So I want to just start with that, like that idea of everything is one being a kind of starting point of the book, and then how we really start to look at that in a way through critical thinking. Was that on purpose? Did you think about that you're actually doing the philosophy of telling the philosophies of the world?
Well, no, I don't know, and I can't remember why I started with that. I mean, I should say that, I had a chapter on that. I mean, what the chapters were going to be about evolves as you look into, what are the recurrent themes.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting that this idea of unity, of a fundamental unity of some sort, does seem to be quite a universal thing. Also, I think the one reason I went for that was that's a very common theme in non-Western philosophies, not so much in Western philosophy, because I wanted to, one thing I really wanted to avoid was an implicit kind of what should I say, privileging or primacy of Western philosophy. Now, I think I acknowledged that to a certain extent it was going to have a privileged position because it was my background.
Yeah, you do say that.
But
You make it
but I
clear.
didn't, yeah, but I didn't want it to sort of be more so than that. I didn't want Western philosophy always to be the reference point. And with the idea of unity, I think it isn't, because it's with particularly Indian Chinese philosophy that you really see that as a more central theme. I mean, actually, interestingly enough, from my own point of view, I mean, first of all, the big metaphysical issues are actually the ones I'm probably most agnostic about. I'm not sure about, and I'm not entirely convinced. I'm not sure how best to understand this idea of unity anyway. So it's
Well, I
not.
think that's
It's
why
not.
I brought it up, because the
Yeah, yeah.
paradox you were presenting, actually, we start to realize that that is different. I mean, because you go into something, for example, like where there's no third way, the law of the excluded middle,
Yeah, yeah.
which I think this gets to the heart of. I mean, you can see the flip, right, from a Western position of thinking about reductionism or
Mm.
atomistic thinking, and how just that's what we take for granted in a way. That's a really flip from what you're presenting of this idea of starting with awareness and becoming more aware that we kind of get in other philosophies. Of course, I'm generalizing, but you do start to see that that's actually very complicated to try to even understand what unity could be. It's not, there's not maybe
Yeah.
a beginning or end to it.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about this sort of the flips and everything. I mean, there were all sorts of traps you can fall into doing this book, and one is sort of just an overgeneralization and an over dichotomization. I mean, I felt in the introduction, I really had to make it clear that, to talk about Western, Eastern, Indian, there are generalizations you can make, right?
And that we are
Um,
making, even if we don't know it
and
or
yeah,
not.
so yeah, there are there's a difference between making a generalization and a universal statement. So the problem is to say Eastern philosophy is like this, Western philosophy is like that, in a way that implies this is universal. We have to accept there's a lot of diversity within each disciplines, but there are generalizations. Generalizations tell you about what tends to be the case. So the simple example you give of this, which is I think obviously true, is around sort of, male and female, right? There are generalizations you can make, which are factually true. For example, around average height, weight, fat to muscle ratios, all these kind of things. I mean, these are incontrovertible. It doesn't mean that every woman is, shorter than every man. Of course it doesn't. We know that's not what it means. So we can make generalizations about the general trends in British, American, French, Chinese, Indian philosophy, as long as we're aware we're not making universal statements. But I think the other really important thing is, and I think the single most important book that I read, and every time I talk about this book, I always mention it, is Tom Kasulis's book, Intimacy or Integrity.
Oh
Because I
yeah.
think he nails he's describing a distinction which he thinks is to do with uh, Eastern and Western and non-Western philosophy, shall we say. And he has a very good way of getting us to understand it. And he says it's not about an either or. It's rather the, to sort of almost quote him, he says, what's foreground in one intellectual tradition is background in the other, and vice versa. So the great thing is, I think what he really alerted me to was that very rarely do you find anything in a non-Western philosophy, which, if you think about it, is completely alien. It's often just something which is not as salient, hasn't been given as much prominence, and you can find it there. And so when you look at it in that way, it becomes very, very, very helpful, I think, to
Yeah, that's a
understand.
very helpful diagram that you give. I don't know if that's yours or his with the circles where they're kind of overlapping and touching or separate. It's more atomistic
Yeah.
or yeah,
Well, that's
integrated.
the other thing. Yeah. Okay. So what I've described as the meta thing about comparative philosophy in general, that's about the specific different orientations he calls them towards intimacy or integrity. Very, I mean, the words aren't particularly helpful, I have to say. You perhaps
They're
could
difficult. I'm
better
still trying to
words.
get past it. I only read
I
it for the
mean,
first time in your book, but
yeah,
it's hard.
I tend to put it about atomized and relational, right?
Yeah,
So
that's more
the
familiar.
Western way of thinking is more atomistic. It tends to always assume that the way to understand anything is to break it down into its constituent parts. And those constituent parts are the most fundamental level of explanation, and everything else is kind of built up from the bottom from them. So, atomistic, because that's the kind of paradigm of natural science, which has actually served us very, very well. But it's kind of become the paradigm for everything else too. So the great example we have in Britain, everyone around the world knows Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister during the 1980s. And she very famously and controversially said this speech in which she said there was no such thing as society. There were only individuals and families and so forth. And society was just the word we use for the collection of these things. And it was interesting because people saw it as a bit of an attack on, an attack on social cohesion and everything. But the general principle, I think, was one which does resonate with people. That's kind of what people think. Society is nothing more than the individuals. Whereas the relational way of looking at things says that that's kind of a mistake because, well, not always, sorry, I shouldn't say it's a mistake. The relational way of looking at things is that to understand what anything is as an individual thing, you have to think about how it relates to other things. So, what's primary? So, if you take you, Andrea, right? I mean, to understand what you are, we don't sort of like first start by isolating you from your history and your environment and your relations and then think about how you might relate to those things. You are who you are. We can only understand who you are by understanding that you're a person who grew up in a particular culture at a particular time with particular parents or guardians, siblings, maybe in a certain community, that you've done certain things in your life. You've been members of communities of learning, of work, and so forth, neighborhoods. You are, in a sense, the totality of your relations, and that's how we best understand you. So the diagram you're talking about there is when if you have two, it has two overlapping circles. And in the Western way of thinking, if you have two overlapping circles and you pull them apart, you have two entire circles. You just pulled them apart. If you remove one circle on this relational view, it's like there's a little crescent left where it overlaps.
It's like the missing piece
A
from
missing
Children
piece, yeah.
or whatever.
And what I think is interesting about that is, one of the things I find interesting about that is that actually kind of fits a lot of around people, that fits our experience. Because when people lose someone who's very close to them, they say it's like I lost a part of myself. And I think the point is that we take that to be a kind of a very powerful metaphor. And I think the Casudis way of putting it suggests, well, it's a bit more than metaphor, really. There is something kind of literally true of that, because you are, to a large part, constituted by your relations. And so if those strongest relations are sundered, a part of you is quite literally taken away. So I think that's true. I
Yes,
should
I think
apologize for
that's
using the word
definitely
interesting, by the way. I use the word interesting all the time.
that's very interesting. No, this is really true, and it can go the other way around too, that you can never, like, once someone has become part of your life, be that, even if it's someone like Leibniz or Spinoza, but especially when it's a person like your father, your mother, your lover, they're also always part of you too. So there's this kind of way in which when they're gone, something is gone, but also that they've changed you and they're with you. So I guess why I'm saying that is there's a way in which, like, we could think of those are kind of 2D things on a page in the book, of course, because it's on the page, but it's probably very much complex and more multidimensional, and there's many, many, many pieces there. And in the book, I feel like, in the same way you kind of started this discussion, you're sort of demonstrating what can't be said with words, which is another theme, language, which is that actually both of these are true in a way, in a kind of situatedness that you've also described via place, but it could also be a situatedness in landscapes of thought. And because as you described it, also in my life, I've read certain books, I've been taught certain things about religion, I've heard certain conversations, and all that goes into my path or my blockchain or whatever we want to call it these days, that does what you were also describing. So is that true? Am I reading you right, that you're kind of trying to open the space, multi-dimensionalize the space a little bit?
It's a nice way of putting it, right? And I think one thing you said there is worth stressing, that Kasuda says you don't have to choose between these two orientations. They're orientations that we take up at different times. The question is really sometimes which is the most appropriate one to take on a particular occasion, right?
Right.
But I think what you said, yes, I mean, I'm not sure. I just agree with what you said, but what you said about these things becoming part of you, I think that is so true. And I think, again, we see that most clearly with the people we are most close to. And it's a very common thing for people who are bereaved when they have lost someone close to them. A lot of people report that they continue to talk to them, right? And they hear their replies. Now, some people interpret that in a literal way. They think they are existing in another world and they're communicating with them. But other people can have exactly the same experience, but they understand what's going on as they have internalized them so much that they can, as it were, continue to kind of, in software analogy, as it were, their software it used to run in their brain, in their body, but by spending a long time together, it starts to run a bit in yours too. And that, I mean, that's kind of a cold way of putting something which is actually much more emotionally powerful.
No, I think it makes sense, even if you think about language and how you learn certain patterns. What's the example you give in a different context, but I think it's of Aboriginal philosopher, maybe talking about patterning is the kind of main theme. There's something about this patterning action that literally becomes part of you, and you're kind of playing those scripts, so to say, when you're talking to someone like my grandmother, for example. I can kind of remember I can think of what she might say in a situation, coming out of that path that was my grandmother.
That's right. And so in a way, this is the sense in which I think we live on after if we live on for at least for a short while after we die. There's no literal sense at all. Yeah.
Pattern thinking. This is, you talk about it somewhere, and it
Yeah.
has to do with the placeness and the situatedness of it, which is a theme I do want to bring up here because you literally traveled to these places, and I wonder how important it was for you to travel in body geographically, not only in text or not only in conversation. Maybe you could have just you had a lot of conversations with a lot of people who
Yeah.
are, really schooled in this. You're not just trying to come up with these ideas yourself. So how
Yeah.
important was the place for you? And because it ends up being where we come to in the book in a way, and it's a theme that resonates there a lot. And I think it also has to do with what we're talking about here about this. When do you choose the right practice or the right angle, the atomistic or the integrated when
Yeah.
has to do with what you're orienting towards.
Well, okay. So, yeah, I mean, it's worth stressing what you say. I mean, I kind of approach this as someone who I didn't set out to become an expert in global philosophy. I set out to speak to experts in the various things and bring it together.
Mhm.
So that's right. I'm not sort of like trying to overreach. The travel aspect was interesting. How important was it? Because I think I think it helped in two ways. It probably wasn't strictly necessary, and I actually have to say that I've become a little bit sort of fed up with it's become a bit of a cliche now for serious nonfiction books to focus on the journey of the author as though that were the most important thing when it really isn't. You know, and sometimes it's all it does is simply reveal how, I don't know, how little the author knew in the first place. There was a book, the Seaspiracy book, I think, a film, sorry, it's a documentary about, serious issues about what's going on in the seas. But it was told through the perspective of this really naive young guy who set out to make a film. And you kind of thought, well, he'd arrive and show how amazed and surprised he was. I think, well, didn't you do your research? That's not the interesting thing that you're surprised.
I know
Tell
what you
me the
mean. It's
facts.
kind of an easy plot to
Yeah,
just, okay,
yeah,
it's going to be a journey and that's going to be
yes,
the plot.
exactly,
Yeah, because
exactly.
everything's a journey, so it seems to make
Exactly.
sense.
So I mean, but I think there are two ways in which it helps. I mean, one is, well, I think it helps for me and the reader in two ways. That by traveling, I was sometimes able to come up with or just stumble upon some sort of cultural examples because I was very much interested in the way in which cultures reflect the thought and vice versa. So this wasn't just like a history of philosophical ideas that you would only of interest if you were interested in philosophy. If you understand a bit about Chinese philosophy, you understand a bit about China. I think I only had 3 pages on Russia, which is a shame. But to be honest, if you understand a little bit more about the history of Russian thought, you understand a lot better what's going on in Russia now,
Well,
right?
you make up for it with Dostoevsky quotes
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
next
yeah.
book.
Okay, yeah. So it is a window into culture. That's the key thing. And by traveling, I think I was able to just sort of like spot things and put things in there, which clarified it to myself, but also hopefully made it evident for the author. Sometimes there are little details which I could never have got just by being here.
Well,
So
one thing that
what?
comes to mind is the Islamic philosophy, religion, difficulty, and that kind of conversation that you overheard. I think that's the one.
Ah, yes, there was
It just lays
well,
it out very
yeah,
perfectly, kind
in
of.
that you had the debate, the tension between, how much is Islamic philosophy actually essentially connected with religion or not, and how much is that a problem? There was almost literally a kind of as close as you get to a proper fight at an academic conference
Yeah,
because two
from
experts who
from
disagree.
that situation and context, not from a
Yeah,
Western one. So it's very
that's right.
helpful.
But I mean, I think one of the favorite examples is such a little one was when I was in Japan. I was only in Japan very, very briefly, but there was this wonderful sign I described whereby it has a picture of somebody with headphones on and there's nothing around them, and someone else with headphones on and there's noise coming out. And it says that it's something like, and I had it translated into English. It said something like music emanating from earphones is just noise or something like that, right?
Yeah,
Now,
it's
what I
very
love,
gentle way of
yeah, yeah, what
calling
I loved about
attention to
this
this
was
loud
now, I mean,
headphone thing.
yeah, now it has been pointed out to me that it's not that in Japan you don't get signs saying don't walk on the grass, don't do this. It's not they don't do that, but the very fact that they could have a sign which didn't give any instruction at all, it simply reminded people that noise from headphones is an irritant. And that would be enough to stop people doing it. And you do notice on public transport in Japan that people are very, 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 very courteous about other people's space. You don't get any of the issues you get on the New York subway and all that kind of thing. Everyone is given space. Everyone is very respectful, and I think that tells you something about that importance of the social. It still has that primacy. Whereas if you go to something like Britain or the UK, we have become so now fixated on our individual rights that there is an erosion of that public space. It drives me crazy. Public parks, for example, in a public park, people think they'll sit down and they'll play their music really loudly, and they think that why can't I'm having a good time? If it bothers you, that's your problem.
Mm-hmm.
People don't think other people don't want to hear my music, you know.
Yeah.
And on the subway where people, yeah, the music comes in the headphones or people. Anyway,
I don't know if
I'm
you
turning
have
into
it
a
here.
grumpy old
Actually,
man now.
I live in Utrecht now, but I was in Berlin for a really long time, and people had started just playing their kind of music without headphones as they go
Yeah.
down the street. I don't know if that's happening in Bristol, but
Yeah, it can happen a bit, and sometimes you do see people on the train, you know, watching a film on their laptop,
yeah.
not with headphones, and you're thinking, what's wrong with you? You know?
Yeah, I think that's what that sign in the book that when you described the sign of the
Yeah.
Japanese subway told me was back to that idea of space and place and how we think of even the individual as something. You kind of learn that through media that in in my culture, from my path, this Western more, that you're supposed to kind of own your space, right?
Mm.
And there's something about that you're almost showing that you have confidence in that you are an individual, which is very different from that sign and the way
Yes.
that sign is interpreted. And that whole section is really interesting
Yeah.
there too. And that kind of goes back to that Thatcher example that you gave too, and that was, around the time when I was going to be born and come through. And there is that way where we're supposed to be individuals, and that's what it's about. And you contribute as an individual. And of course, as you point out in your books, I'm not sure which one because I read both of these closely, maybe both. That's kind of one of the problems that we're facing now. I think at some point you say that a lot of this, what we've seen politically, that's just been difficult and challenging in terms of not being able to communicate, or the populism ends up being a problem with belonging. How is that connected, do you think? You
Yeah.
look at a lot of that in the book,
Well,
belonging and individualism.
okay, yeah. I mean, I think it goes back to the point that these things aren't either ors, and I think that the problem is when you get the balance kind of wrong. And my concern is not that, I mean, I am a product of Western culture, and I think are therefore inevitably going to value certain aspects of its individualism. And I would find it very, very difficult. I wouldn't find it desirable to live in cultures where there was a lot less of it, where I had much more pressure to conform. So it's not about, but I think that it's reached the stage where it gets out of balance and it creates a kind of backlash. So in if you think in Europe now and also in North America, the sort of nativist populist nationalism. I mean, this is what happens when people are feeling like the world has been taken over by these rootless cosmopolitan liberal elites who don't place any value on community, tradition, and value. Then it gets asserted even more strongly and in ways which are not sort of healthy. So I think a lot of the populist stuff is a reaction against the kind of fragmentation of society that an excessive individualism has created. Now, of course, the point is a lot of these people who support these parties, of course, there are certain things around their own individualism which they really value. In America, I think you probably see this really strongly because, on the one hand, you have the Make America Great Again nationalism, chuck out this, that, and the other. But in America, you also get a very strong, we don't want the state involved, the individual should be free, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
So this is sort of like intention both to assert the supreme sovereignty of the individual over their own lives, but also somehow to assert the importance of nation and community and state. And it becomes rather a mess where people don't really realize what the compromises and the balances need to be.
Yes, and I think to try to get into this messy nuance, a lot of that is that we do still have this either or mindset. Not that we hold both of them and think that at some point this might be right or this might be right, and there's not only two, there's always multiple dimensions. We don't think like that. It's very hard. So it's usually either or. So in fact,
Mm.
as you just described it, most people are most things just an extreme in one situation or another. And so it's not that just like one party is individualistic and the other one is not. But we tend to try to put it like that, and then we end up
Yeah.
sort of fighting about those things. Do you see that? I mean, you talk about the Platonic Cartesian path, I'll say, that a lot of these countries that we think of as Western have followed. Do you see that as connected to this problem? I mean, in the end, is it about all of us opening to one another's paths a little more around the world to balance this out? I mean, because
Yeah.
harmony is not an easy idea either in the book. So,
Yes. Well, I know these are very big questions. I think that as you say, the kind of sort of dichotomous ways of thinking and black and white thinking are problematic because at the end of the day, the world and important things don't tend to be like this. Yeah,
they've been very helpful too, as you show. So it's even on
yeah,
this issue, it's kind of, you can't
sure.
say one or the other.
Well, sure. I mean, we wouldn't have computer programming without
Zeros
binaries.
and
So
ones. Yeah.
binaries, so binary logic sits behind computer programming. Reductionism is behind most of the great successes in science. But even there, you see, the point now is that even in the natural sciences, again, to prove this isn't an either or thing, a lot of the most interesting fields in science now, I think, are the ones which are about the systems levels rather than the reductive levels. So there is lots of very serious science going on, which is saying there's only so far you can go. On a reductionism thing, you have to look at the interactions and the systems, etc. But maybe I'm dodging your question. But then
No, I think that's true too, because we're even trying to create quantum computers, which get past 0, 1, or the idea of spatial web. So there is some change, but here I'll put it in a different way. We could generalize this and say, okay, there's been one way of thinking in the West, which is either or based on Platonic or
mm,
Cartesian ideas, where we think there's a mind and a body, there's a right and there are wrong. And then there's a more Eastern way of thinking where we start in presence in some, like in India, or it's more about the feeling, the awareness, the consciousness, and we start as integrated or intimate, and that is life, and it's just about that. Like, so we could think of it as these extremes. And is the point now to integrate those two things? Is that going to be helpful? Or,
yeah,
yeah.
well, as I say, I think it's about integrate. Maybe that's the right word. I'm not sure. As I say, it's about finding the appropriate place for each, and to use. In a sense, they're two sort of ways, modes of understanding, modes of apprehending, and to bring them together. I think that's true, and I think it's kind of possible. I mean, if I do talks on this, a common question would be something like, do you think it'd be possible to create a single global philosophy? Could you, as it were, synthesize all the best elements?
Mm.
Is there perhaps a perennial and singular philosophy behind all of this? And I think the answer to that is kind of no, actually. I think that we have to accept there's a fundamental pluralism about humanity, which means that there's always more than one way to do pretty much anything. There's more than one way to do anything, and more than one way to think about anything. More than one way to order a society, more than one way to live a good life, more than one way, perhaps even to do science. It doesn't mean anything goes. There are certainly bad ways of doing things and wrong ways of doing things, but there will be more than one right way of doing things. So I think it'd be kind of mistaken to think that we should ever expect there to be a single kind of a value system or moral order or political order which will work for everyone. But nonetheless, I think that where we understand commonality, I have this analogy which is the most helpful one I can think of, and I think it does help. It's helpful. So I think of, if let's think about ethics, just stick to ethics as it works best for this. The idea of this mixing desk. So what I'm asking people to imagine is, if you are recording, let's say you're recording keep it simple, a 12-piece band in a music studio. Well, the typical way you do that is that each instrument would have its own channel, and it would go into the mixing desk. And if you're producing the record, well, you have to decide at what level to set the different instruments, right? Because there might be times where you need to put up the guitar. In the guitar solo, perhaps you might raise the volume on the guitar, but if it was that loud through the whole song, it would be too loud.
Mhm.
And so you have this kind of balance. So this is what the mixing desk does. You've got 12 elements, and you put them up and down. Now, I kind of think when it comes to most moral values, Most moral values are universal in the sense that you find them all over the world. What's different is the settings, right? And the point is you can't turn them all up to 10. You can't have them all down to 0. They're going to be different settings. So typically, for example, in the West, we have a higher setting for values around things like autonomy and personal freedom. In most places in the West in the past, and in lots of other places, there is a higher setting for kind of community and for relational values, etc. Now, there's no reason why we should expect or suppose or even hope that every culture is going to end up with the same set of settings. But understanding that we are working with the same basic set of values, and it's not about denying the importance of any of them, I think can help us to, first of all, understand other cultures, but also learn from them so that perhaps there'll be a little bit more convergence. So societies where, I mean, let's just be critical of the West, where the individualistic setting, we can see we've set it too high, right? We may not want to set it as low as it is in somewhere like China. Well, China now, we definitely wouldn't want it that low, but as low as it is, say, in Korea. But nevertheless, we might say lower than where we are now, not as low as Korea would be right for us. So you might therefore, hopefully, the most optimistic scenario is that by learning from each other, we can take out some of the extremes and we can all end up living in a society which all of us can look at and see as reasonable, fine, and good, but not exactly the same.
I like that answer. It reminds me of, I think you talk of it as a multiple perspectives or a cubist or trying to really understand the yin yang, which isn't actually opposites because they're all part of each other. So, but when you're talking about that, it sounds, we could assume there's a thing that's knowledge that we're going to find or that we're setting. But I wonder if you see it, you mentioned complex systems, dynamic systems, more as, here's how I kind of was imagining it as you were talking, that coming from a particular society, I come from the Western society, but as I've visited other landscapes, be that just through books, Eastern books from Japan or Korea or China or India or wherever, it opens up what I can imagine and what I can know. And I can then, when I'm in a situation, I know there's different alternatives other than just those ones that I learned on my little path, because now there's all these other paths and I can start to think, oh, maybe I could look at it this way or this way. And then that mixing board comes in well, because then you have a lot more tools to negotiate whatever situation you're in. And I guess that could be true for any of us, no matter where we're situated around the world. But then knowledge isn't a static thing, is it? It's because as I'm doing that, I'm changing what's possible, what knowledge can be possible, what I can imagine. So that question you get asked, could there be like one set way, almost doesn't make sense, because there would always be so many moving parts about that we're all constantly having to renegotiate.
Yeah. Well, I think, it'd be hard to imagine a point at which our understanding was finished. I think it is perhaps where it is helpful. One of the more helpful kind of themes you get, particularly in Chinese philosophy, East Asian philosophy in general, actually, is this sense of the fundamental nature of reality as being something which is in a process. Um, it's not static. It's not fixed. That's a contrast which a lot of people have remarked upon. So again, go back to Plato. There's kind of an idea that ultimate reality has a kind of unchanging permanence to it, and our goal is to sort of recognize what it is and then approximate to it. Whereas, I think in most East Asian thought, things are in process, things are in flow, so there would never be some final state. And I think that we don't have to sort of, you can get a grip on this simply by thinking about, okay, let's put it this way. Human culture and society has evolved and changed and will continue to change. And as long as you accept the basic plausible assumption that as the material and physical and social conditions change, so too might some of the ways in which we have to live and think in it, then you can see that, just as we would say it had been terrible if we were still thinking as they did in the 18th century and the 21st century, we have to assume that for people to be thinking as we do now at the beginning of the 21st century is probably going to be inappropriate in the 23rd. Now, there's going to be plenty that's continuous, just as we look at 18th century philosophers and ancient philosophers and we recognize lots of things and we learn from them. It's not like we have to chuck everything out, but it's the constant sort of evolution, I think, is really important. So, yeah, we have to be prepared to see things as having a certain open-endedness. And I think going back, perhaps relating the themes of the two book in a way, you know, that sense of provisionality that we're never there, that we've got to keep at it, is really important. And the moment we think we have cracked it, that's end, we got the full stop. That's the beginning of kind of, mental stagnation. There's the old maxim in business, they say, in business, they say, in order to even stay where you are, you've got to move forward. That if you stop developing, you're going to go backwards. I think the same kind of thing goes with thinking. As individuals and as a society, if you don't try to keep improving and keep developing your thinking, the quality of it is probably going to get worse. It won't just stay the same.
I think you show that very well in the second book, which we won't have much time to talk about now, but maybe another time, How to Think Like a Philosopher. Because I think in there you actually say, if something seems obvious or if it's not going questioned, that's probably a good reason to start questioning it. I guess what's hard about this is that people want to go back to that idea of belonging or feeling sort of secure and situated. We do want that. And so you quote Rorty a lot, I think, in these books. Richard Rorty, who I've gotten a lot from, especially his earlier, or not the really late stuff, but in any case, he talks about truths, like plural, not a truth. But we can also go overboard with that too, where it becomes, I think you talk about pluralism. It doesn't mean that everything is what's the word?
It's not relativism. It's not the same relativism.
Pluralism isn't relativism. So there's also, we're constantly having to kind of go to the other side of where we are too, and remember that it's not a linear, easily contained thing, but there are real paths, there are real things that can be traced that are truth.
I mean, again, this is just so true, because I think that, again, people want things to be either or, and they think you've got to choose between the singular, unshakable truth or whatever's true for you, and a sort of a democracy of all truths. And clearly, neither of those things are tenable. It's got to be something in between. And time and again, I find this, I mean, one of my books is on personal identity, and it's the idea that
that's what you wrote your thesis on too, right?
That's my thesis on, my PhD thesis. So, it's a very common idea, which you find in neuroscience, David Hume, Buddhist thought. There is no singular self. The self is not this indivisible, permanent entity. It's a collection of things. And that opens up certain possibilities. But, I've had people sort of saying, I sort of bury my head in my hands, because I try and stress this isn't the case. That doesn't mean that the notion of the self is a completely empty one, that there's literally no sense at all of talking about the individuals. And it certainly doesn't mean that we have absolute freedom to constitute ourselves exactly as we want. The fact that our identities are to a certain degree malleable, changeable, not fixed, is liberating in some ways, but we can't just imagine that we can be anything. That's kind of a
for me, it gets to what you said earlier about when you were describing the individual, that kind of, it's not the self, but there is a spatio-temporal, literal path that I've had through life, and that's also through all my knowledge landscapes. And according to that path, I'm going to experience my context in a different way, and no one person has the same path. We can't spatio-temporally have the same path, no matter how similar everything we experience might be on some level or how far away. So there's a way in which if you can open it up and start to see it like that, you can understand that we're sharing the same space, but we're not experiencing it the same way. Like, my parents didn't say the same thing to me or treat me the same as you. I didn't read the same books as you. I haven't been to the same places as you, so on. And maybe that's kind of in your book, or in a lot of, I sort of like to try to think of it like that, and that maybe opens up that space a little bit too, in terms of not choosing either or, but still believing there is I have a truth and you do too, and how do we communicate about that, and in so doing sort of change what's possible.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, I get you there, and I think I agree. But I think when we say you and I have our different truths, we just got to be a bit careful what we mean by that. Certainly the case that we have our different experiences, our different etc. etc. What it can't mean is simply that whatever you think is true, and I can't contest it, and vice versa. In fact, it's
Right.
very important. It's the opposite. I mean, I think that the point is that we only one of the things we have underestimated in Western philosophy is that knowledge formation is a largely social enterprise. We have this sort of image of the solitary thinker, the philosopher who works it all out. It's all in your own head. It
Mm-hmm.
isn't the case. I challenge anyone, to think about, make a list of the things you believe and everything, and ask yourself, would it have been possible to even form those beliefs without other people doing some of your mental work for you, And the answer is no. I mean, sometimes people have found things out and explained them to us. On other cases, we have a very shaky understanding, which is based on taking the word of someone who we have reasons to believe their understanding is a lot better. Every time we go to a doctor, it's kind of like that. So there is this kind of collective, communal dimension to knowledge, which is vital. And so that's why it's really, really important. We don't think that it is wrong to challenge each other's beliefs. We need to be challenged because that's how we get better at what we think, right? I, I, I'm going to be right more often if people are prepared to tell me when I'm wrong, right? I'm going to be right a lot less if people just say, "Oh, well, no, you have the right to believe what you believe." So if you say it's going to rain and I know it's not going to, I'm not going to challenge that view. It's crazy. So I think this is weird. It's completely misguided to think that the way in which you show most respect for someone is simply not to challenge what they think. In a way, that's not respecting them because you respect someone's capacity as a reasoner by assuming that they have the capacity to respond to challenge either by having a good answer to it or by revising their views accordingly. And I think it goes back to the theme actually of, you know, global philosophy. When we talk about sort of intercultural dialogue, I think that it's important to sort of understand what respect really means here. And I think sometimes people think to respect something, you have to be free of all criticism, that it's not your place to criticize. And again, I think that's just wrong. And actually, it's also, people don't genuinely believe it because a lot of people say that actually will be very, very happy and will actually want to criticize Western thought on the basis of the wisdom of non-Western traditions, right? So they think Westerners should absolutely be listening when to Aboriginal wisdom, to Amazonian wisdom, or whatever it might be. But Westerners must not be critical of other cultures. No, we what we should never do is wade in with great confidence, no sensitivity, no desire to understand, and sweep aside and dismiss the views of other cultures. But engaging with them properly means being prepared to say, I'm not sure about that, or that seems wrong, and being willing to have yourself challenged too. That's how we make progress.
I'm really glad you said that because it is really important that we don't. That's part of what we're trying to maybe figure out is how to, and maybe that's what critical thinking can do and why we do want to know how to think like a philosopher in a way, because it does teach you that it's okay to be questioned and it's okay to question, and it's not questioning some kind of essence or something that you have to defend. It has to do with what I hope is changing the idea of self too, to open it up a bit, that we're not just oneself, and we're part of this larger community. As you say, we're not solitary thinkers, even though we do have to take responsibility for our actions and ourself. But
Mhm.
maybe there's some way in which, if people can think like a philosopher or take some philosophy classes, it is a kind of practice, isn't it, to be able to take criticism and give criticism from a position that isn't judgmental or taking it personally, because that is not an easy thing to learn how to do.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we sort of come full circles. I think early in the conversation you talked about philosophy as a practice, and I think it kind of is. But I think what's important, and the thing I think try to stress in how to think like a philosopher, is that in a sense it's a kind of it's an ethical practice, or it's a practice with a very strong ethical dimension. People sometimes think that philosophy is primarily about, sharpening up your logical chops, as it were, being rigorous. Is about the formal aspects of good thinking. And those things are all important. But I stress quite a lot in the book the importance of what I sometimes call the virtues of thought, which is you have to bring the right attitudes to your thinking. And the
Mm.
right attitudes are things around things like a sincerity of intent, a genuine desire to understand more or to get to the bottom of it, rather than a desire to vindicate yourself or to be correct. A real determination and effort to where the facts are important, getting the facts right, and not just simply accepting or what you've been told as though it were fact. And also that perhaps another really key one is the genuine intent to try to understand the other, the person you're encountering with, the idea you're encountering with, to really try and get behind it and get a grip on it, rather than sort of assume that you kind of know what it means when you first hear it, whatever it might be. So it's a kind of ethical, it's an ethical practice, and I think that's why a lot of not all professional philosophers are good thinkers, and also why not just in philosophy, why but there are some very, very smart people who are not very good thinkers, in the sense that they basically use their brain power instrumentally to get them to where they want to be. If you've got a really powerful brain, you can do that. But that's quite scary, because I think one thing we learn from psychology, and I think you have to understand psychology if you want to be a good thinker as well. We
Be a
know from,
psychologist. That's one of
yeah,
the,
being a psychologist is one of the big things.
yeah.
Psychology tells us how we are very, very prone to self-deception, to self-serving reasoning, to confirmation bias, all these kind of things. So if you have a really clever person who hasn't got the right set of motivations, they are going to almost certainly be able to come up with some very, very powerful and strong and convincing arguments for why they're right, right?
Hmm.
But they're not going to be right, you know?
Yeah, that's a really difficult thing too, is this kind of it is a skill to think critically, and you can practice it and become really good at it to the point where you can bully others, and also you can just sound like you know what's right and there's only this path. So, but I do think part of critical thinking is you start to realize people can do that once
Yeah,
and then you're on the
yeah.
lookout for it a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think what is true, you kind of like have to sort of like spot the semblance of great intelligence for what is actually something else, which is often overconfidence and arrogance. I think it's actually, and I think, I'm prone to that. It's not something you can ever
Mhm.
sort of, a lot of these effects are really strong. Even today, when I meet someone who speaks with extreme confidence and erudition and articulately about something, it's difficult. You find yourself thinking, oh, well, are they right? Are they right? Actually, I had someone, before it was published, I gave a talk about this. And there was someone who, whose family was from Indian descent, who really sort of laid into me almost, telling me that I was talking nonsense a bit. And again, they had confidence, they were articulate, they seemed to know what they were talking about. They had a certain cultural background in it. So, and I sort of like, I did have to sort of go home and sort of double check a few things. And, I said, no, I'm right. The point was, and I could see then, this was a classic case of overconfidence, that this person simply, I don't know, they were talking with, they weren't actually, okay, they were from the Indian subcontinent, but they're not philosophers and all that kind of stuff, and they were talking with an excess of confidence. But it can really, really shake you. And actually, I
Yeah,
should
it
say
does.
there,
It's almost like an
this,
inertia. It's
yeah,
really hard to resist it.
I would say though that was a rare occasion where the person of that kind was a woman. It has to be said. I don't know. It's probably cultural. I don't know whether it's cultural or but for various reasons, most of these excessively confident, arrogant people, they're more male ones around than female.
Yeah, I won't go into that. There would be a lot to talk about with the whole male
Yes.
female thing. we'd have to have a whole other conversation. But
Yeah,
I think what's good to know is just that you did that you took it in and you went home and checked the facts. I mean, that's almost an example of what you're offering in How to Think Like a Philosopher is you do take it seriously and then you check it, you know. It's not just because someone's confident that you say, oh, they must know what they're talking about, which I think the more like now there's so much going on and we have so little time, it feels like that we often just go with that, whether
yeah,
it's online or in person. You just kind of think they must know what they're talking about. You
yeah,
don't
yeah.
even question it. You just go with it, you know.
Well, this is actually quite important because I think how much people often say, well, you can't check everything. How much do you check? When do you check? And you have to get the balance right. And I'm
Mm.
not saying that I always go away and double check when someone very confidently says stuff. You have to have certain kind of reason to perhaps worry that you're right or wrong. But you've reminded me of something I've kind of forgotten, which was many, many years ago. I remember interviewing or speaking to a philosopher who said that what their philosophical training had given them was more confidence, as it were, to hold their ground in a way. It's not, I'm paraphrasing a bit, but I think, see, that's kind of the wrong lesson. I think that's what does sometimes happen. Sometimes people do their philosophy. They think, I'm actually a good critical, I know how to do this critical thinking stuff. Thank you very much. So now if someone comes along and they say something which I don't agree with, I can just destroy them more powerfully than I could before.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. It happens a lot that people become such good analytic philosophers or critical thinkers, and then it just becomes a fight of who can be the better
Yeah.
arguer, which in a certain space is very interesting, but there's a lot more to think about and to worry about than just that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we're almost out of time, so oh, we are out of time. But I did want to ask, it seems that this changed you, the travel, the writing of this book. In the first book, though, How the World Thinks, the second book, it's a different kind of book than the other books you've written in a way. Do you think so? I mean, there's a wider perspective in it. I don't know. I wonder, did it change you, this thinking about
Yeah.
how the world thinks?
Well, I think, I think that change is, in some ways, it's depressing how little we change, but we do. It tends to happen gradually, but I think that it did change me in various ways, and I think that there's perhaps the single most important thing is the one I alluded to earlier, which is that I think that having kind of become sensitized to the ways in which a lot of typical Western ways of thinking are very compartmentalized and atomized, I've become much more, I think, sensitive to that sort of relational dimension and the importance of that. And that I can sometimes now, I think, kind of see. So that's changes the way I think about a lot of things in that way. So I think that's been a really big, big shift. There are other things as well. But I think, the way in which we change is interesting. It's naturally generally quite incremental. You can sometimes have an experience in life where something so fundamental changes, such as you lose your faith in God or you gain your faith in God, that a whole load of changes flow from it. But the point about our belief system and worldviews is that they are interconnected wholes. And, if you change one part, it changes another. And that means that in effect, usually it means that it's very rare for lots of things to change completely. It'd be too much would have to be disrupted. But I think it does. And I think in general the way in which we change is fascinating. You read, funnily enough, I don't get to read enough fiction. And I was lucky enough to have an excuse to read a couple of novels recently, very thoughtful, intelligent novels. And you have this kind of effect at the end of it. That it's somehow it's tweaked your worldview a little bit,
Hmm.
see the world a little bit different, and it's all incremental. And perhaps it goes back to this idea you were talking about how it's important to see this thing as like a process. It's a process
Hmm.
without end, yeah. I hope I never reach the stage where my worldview is not constantly being, my model of the world is constantly being tweaked and updated according to the new stuff I've come along. But how the world thinks, I think, was you know, a major reboot in the sense that it gave me that whole different way of looking at things relationally, which opened up perhaps a big area which was missing in my thinking before.
Yeah, well, what felt important for me is kind of at the beginning. I mean, you're an expert in a lot of ways. People would come to you as an expert. You're on BBC as an expert, But you kind of say, hey, I'm not an expert on this. I'm going to go learn about it from people who know a lot more about
Mm,
it than me. There's
yeah.
something about that in life, if we can keep doing that, because we're all not experts of everything. And it can be hard to do that, but to just realize, you say you're a little embarrassed in a way that there's this whole other area of philosophy. Let's go learn about
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah.
That for me is a really wonderful gift or offering.
Well, thank you.
There was other things I wanted to ask you about, but I think you probably need to go.
Yeah, not this second, but if you
Okay, well, let's
soon.
just get into this a little bit then, and
Okay.
then I'll let you go. But this idea of thought, thinking, it's in a lot of your books, thinking, thought, and this is all about how we think and knowing. And I'm not going to ask you about the relation between knowledge and thinking, but are we just our thought, Julian? I mean, in the book, you talk a lot about thought, and then in these other cultures, awareness or something like being, attention, consciousness. Those all get lumped together as almost like the same thing. But I feel like in the book, they're not always the same thing. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, if I go back to the personal identity issue, the philosopher that I was really, my PhD was writing the footnotes to was Derek Parfit, who's a very well-known
Mm,
philosopher. And, his basic view that personal identity, in other words, you are the person you are as a consequence of the psychological connectedness and continuity over time. Now, psychological connectedness and continuity, it really suggests that you are what's going on in your head primarily. Now, I think there's something really important to that, but I think that if you're a philosophical kind of person, there's a great danger you're going to overestimate the extent to which, your experiences, as it were, are primarily of the intellectual thought. It seems to me very obvious that we are, let's put it this way, I'd put it this way, we are the collection, an ordered collection of experiences, essentially. But the point is, a lot of those experiences are not just intellectual, purely intellectual or purely mental. They're sort of physiological, they're embodied as well. So some of Parfit's critics said he underestimated the extent to which we are importantly embodied. And I think he did and he didn't. He did not talk about that, but it was compatible with his framework. And I think perhaps again, a change after the book is, I'd say, not just embodied, but socially, physically, geographically, ecologically located as well. So I think we are the sum of our experiences, if you like, but those experiences can't just be reduced to little private, purely mental things. They're the whole of our experience, social, bodily, as well as purely private and mental. But I think that is kind of it. I mean, I don't see what else we could be, because on what else could we be on top of that? Some little soul stuff. Well,
Well, just
that's
being, I mean, bodies, I think it's good you brought, that's where I wanted to go. But I think what we think of as thought isn't all of cognition. It's a little tip of the iceberg, in terms of what
yeah.
we're aware of, this kind of language-based thing. And I guess what I'm saying is there's a kind of, we could think of it as Kant with perception and cognition or something. There's in the same way to how it's been difficult to talk about these either ors and
Mm,
there's no third way, but everything's the third way. There's a kind of way too where we confuse cognition and perception and the body and
mm.
the brain.
Well, yeah. There is a temptation to say we are essentially our bodies. We are these biological organisms, and I think what's true is that our experiences are very much dependent upon our bodies. I suppose what's also true is that we wouldn't be who we were without a whole lot of stuff which we are not directly consciously aware of. So to say that we are essentially defined by our awareness is not to say that therefore the things we are not aware of aren't vitally important, right? So that's where it gets a bit tricky. But I think the reason why at the end of the day you'd want to say that the body isn't the identity thing is the simple kind of thought experiment, which is that, if I have a terrible accident and they're able to replace pretty much all the parts of my body with other parts, and I come out the other end, I'm still me. So I need a body, and my body informs who I am, etc., etc. But what would identify me as who I am would has to be centered around what we call the psychological, or let's call it the experiential.
Mhm.
But that's not to deny the absolute importance of the social and the biological in that, right?
See,
So
I would, that's a kind of ship of Theseus thing. Like, how does the
yeah.
ship that starts on one side of the world, let's say it's a wooden ship, and then
Mm,
by the time it gets all the way around, this is a long time ago,
mm,
all the parts have been replaced, all the crew has been replaced.
mm,
How is it the same thing? I mean, for me, that it has to do with this path, this spatiotemporal position and patterning. That
mm,
pattern has been the same. So is the spatiotemporal continuity. And I
mm.
don't see that that's different from body and brain and mind. And like, for me, that patterning is not discontinuous. You don't
Sure.
separate it in a Socrates way, like the soul is trapped in the body, but it's all kind of one patterning that's,
Yeah, but I think that's true. But I think the point of it, I think what's critical about the patterning, there's something critical about the conscious awareness aspect of that for a person, because the point is this, that if you go through your life as a single biological organism, but you experience some kind of brain trauma such that, it totally erases your memories and transplants your personality, most of us would say that to all important senses of the word, the person who was in that body is no longer there, right? And I think that's true. I mean, it's not a strict either or. I think even being the same person is a matter of degree because we change over time. But there are some ruptures which are so strong that it would be possible to say that even though the body continues to exist, the person doesn't. And I think that's why it's not exactly the same as like the ship of Theseus, because again, it's a whole other discussion, really. I mean,
yeah.
what's important for making it the ship is not that it has the same parts at each time in its life, it's that it has a certain ongoing structure, history, blah, blah, blah. That's what matters for it being a ship. What matters for us is very, very tightly connected to, say, our awareness and our memories and our plans and our intentions and our beliefs. Without those things, we're not. We take away those things, you don't have a person. I can't say, look, I'm going to offer you the opportunity to uh, I'm going to do something to you, which is going to give you, it's going to improve your capacities in 100 different ways, right? The only problem is the operation is going to eliminate your memories, your desires, your projects, you wouldn't do it because it would be in effect saying you're going to kill me and use my body for something else. So that's why I think it's the experiential side is absolutely core to being who we are.
But again, I don't think it's either or. Again,
Right.
this would be a big conversation, but yes, like let's somebody changes their personality or their memory. There's some kind of like HM where there's a memory loss, or there's still continuity. We could still think of it as a ship. Maybe the ship used to have some certain kind of kitchen capabilities that it kind of loses, but I think the way I would answer that is if we think of the self differently as not only like me or let's say my grandmother, right? When she did lose her memory towards the end and she wasn't the same person in exactly the way you said, but she was for us. So we were holding those patterns. Those patterns still exist. I still have them now in the way we talked about in the beginning. So I don't think it went away. It's just that the ability, the navigability, how she could make her own way, changed. Like she was no longer able to find her way in the way she had before. But you know, at
Okay.
some level, it was still those patterns were still there. They're still there
Okay.
now.
Okay. So perhaps we shouldn't, because this is a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
I do see what you mean, and I do
Didn't
talk.
mean to get into that.
I talk about dementia as an example in the Ego Trick, the book about this. I think the key point is this: that what you're saying is an experience which I think a lot of people find to be true. That even towards the very end of dementia, people do not feel completely that that person has gone. Now, the point is you can understand that in a couple of different ways. One way is to think that everyone has some kind of like essence, and the essence never goes, right? And I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. I think what he'd rather say is that because we are a collection and a pattern and all that kind of stuff, as long as there is some degree of continuity, there is something of that person still there. And because the way in which we relate to other people is through bodies, etc., etc., thankfully, we can still have care for someone when at the same time we recognize that they're virtually gone. So I think there's a certain kind of there's almost an ambiguity there. There was a great example I had of someone I spoke to for that book who his wife had dementia at a horribly young age, I have to say. It was pretty
Mm,
early onset. And he's very kind. I went and visited her with him, and
mm,
she barely recognized him anymore. And he was saying within the sort of community of people whose relatives have dementia, they have this sort of phrase of like being like half a widow. So, people have this question mark, are they free to have a new relationship while the person is still alive? And this is this sort of like, the holding of the two things together. There is a sense in which he is still the husband of this woman, in which he still loves her, and which he is still there for her. And there's a sense in which she's almost completely gone. She's not the wife, etc., etc. And it's holding both these things at the same time.
yeah.
That makes sense if you do not see personal identity as an either or thing, as a matter of degrees of continuity. So I think that's the kind of point there. Yeah.
And also to the situatedness that we talked about earlier,
Mm.
because my grandmother was a different person to me than she is to my father. And,
Yeah.
a lot of it is just that my story, it has been broken, not hers so much. I mean, it has for her, but in a way I can't really understand. So, I mean, there's a lot of different ways we could look at that, but I think it's a very important thing to think about on all kinds of levels. I mean, I think it's a good example of why philosophy is important in critical thinking, because
Yeah.
it matters on emotional levels, but it matters on ethical levels, and it
Mm.
matters on medical levels, how we, try to assess and where all of that really gets
Yeah.
together. But well, I'll have to read that book, and then we'll
Okay.
see. Is there anything that you really wanted to say that we haven't said, or?
Oh no, no, we could go on further, but no, it's been a very interesting.
Yeah, I could go on and on. I didn't even
I
get through half my
yeah,
things, but
I don't feel there's anything sort of pressing that I ought to have got out, which I didn't. I've probably spoken too much already.
no, no, it's been really good. I guess just to kind of end it, if somebody's never uh, thought about philosophy before, where would you kind of tell them to start with your books, by the way, or any books? Should they
Uh,
start with How the World Thinks, or should they lead
Well,
into
I mean,
your?
look, I have to say, in a way, I mean, it sounds sort of arrogant, but as I say, I wrote How the World Thinks because the book didn't exist, and I think it should. So, in a way, it's not a bad place to start, I have to say. But these days, of course, I would suggest maybe, you don't even have to start with books. The Philosophy Bites podcast series is very, very good. There's a huge archive there, like 15 minutes typically with philosophers, and you get a good range of them. Or even sort of going a bit more sideways, Kieran Setier's Five Questions podcast is a series of interviews with contemporary philosophers. And, you get a good flavor, I think, of what philosophy is by hearing these people. It's not kind of a history of ideas kind of podcast. If you're really feeling ambitious, and you're interested in global philosophy, you should get Peter Adamson's History of Philosophy with No Gaps podcast,
Hmm.
which I think is now got about 800 episodes.
Oh wow,
It is
that's
extraordinary. I mean, he is. I said when I started the book, there were not many people could really claim to be an expert in global philosophy. There are lots of comparative philosophers who do Eastern and Chinese, Western and whatever. Peter Adamson has taken on the whole of global philosophy and has created this amazing, and there's some books coming out of it as well. But I mean that it will take you years to catch up.
wow. I mean, I guess there's no end to that. If it's without gaps, he's just got to keep going and going. But
Yeah,
that's amazing.
exactly. Without any gaps, I guess you're right. If he's going to
There's
be
no way you can
52,
stop.
exactly, he'll just be filling. It'd be a fractal thing. Once you've got no gaps at that level, you zoom in and you see where the
There's
gaps
more,
are. Yeah.
exactly. Well, Julian, are you one? I wonder, you've always had success as a popular philosopher, but you're also like a philosopher's philosopher. There's not a lot of people like that. Was that an accident? Like, how did you become kind of a best-selling philosopher and still a consultant by the BBC when it comes to philosophy?
Yeah, okay, right. But I mean, bestseller is a let's remember bestseller is kind of a technical term. It refers
Yeah.
to you have appeared on the best-selling chart in a given week. It doesn't mean that you've been in, etc. So let's not get too carried away.
Okay,
Uh,
but when I go into bookshops in the States, I see your books.
oh,
When I
that's
go
good.
into bookshops in Utrecht or Berlin, I see your books.
Oh, that's
This
good.
is
That's nice.
pretty unusual, especially today where people don't buy books much.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that is good. I mean, I think there are popular philosophers who have sold than me. I don't know because I don't compare or even check my own things. Look, it's just there's no master plan.
It
When I
just
finished
happened.
when I finished my PhD, I wanted to keep doing philosophy. I've always liked writing in a sense, if it wasn't philosophy, I'd be hopefully writing about something else.
I was going to
And
ask you, did Tim Crane in that comment, do you think he set you on the road to becoming a writer when he told you, I can't remember exactly what he told you,
oh
but
yeah, yeah. Oh no, he was telling me that I had to sort of be a much better self-editor, as it were. But I was already interested in,
you were,
I'd wanted to do that before. So I mean,
all right.
I think didn't turn me on the path. I think it's just that I have never had a master plan, and I think the things have worked out because I've never had a master plan, and I've also, thankfully, for some reason, never had any great anxiety about how much I should be earning or where I should be, which is not, by the way, sometimes when you say that, I think people think that means you must have some kind of private income or something, which is very,
Mm,
very far from the true. I didn't have any family
your
money at
secret
all.
royal somewhere.
No, 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 absolutely not. But I wasn't bothered. I was just, and I really only ever looked more than most about 3 years in advance if you're doing a PhD or something. And yeah, I started the Philosophers magazine with Jeremy Stangram after the PhD, and that gave a bit of a platform which enabled me to write, and it built from there. So it's just been, you know, the old cliche, you put one foot in front of another and then you put another foot there.
Yeah,
And I've been very lucky. But there's a lot of luck involved, isn't there? There's a lot of
there
luck
is.
involved.
Yeah.
I mean, the pig that wanted to be eaten, we mentioned earlier, did sell very well. And had that not sold very well, I don't know. Might not be able to do what I do because, you're given the opportunity to write books on the basis of how your past ones have done, and to have a successful book, and they at that stage in the career gave a little bit of a wind in my sails.
Mm. Put you in the
So
right community too to continue
yeah,
publishing
so
wise.
yeah, so I've stuck at it. I haven't
I guess my
slacked.
real question I wonder is, do you let your interests and passion guide you? Which I guess you kind of answered that you don't really worry about the
Well, I
money.
mean, yeah, but I wouldn't want to, not in a purist sense. You
Hmm.
have to be pragmatic. If a publisher doesn't want to publish something, then you can't do it. So I couldn't afford ever to say I'm going to write what I want to write, and if the public wants it, great. If not, not. Because otherwise, I'd have to go and got a job, a cafe or something, because I wouldn't have any money. But I think I've been quite fortunate in that I've been able to. I have never. I can honestly say I haven't written anything that I haven't wanted to write in some way. And the projects which have been a bit more instrumental, they've still been worth doing, but they haven't been. So I've been pleased that I've done them, and I've judged they weren't going to sort of so occupy my time there to just distract me. But you have to have a certain patience as well. So, for example, I mentioned the ego trick book. That was about personal identity. That's my PhD thesis. And I always wanted to do a book on that. But I was aware that in the early days, the kind of books that I could do had to be more general introductions because I wasn't established in any way. So I had to, as it were, earn the right to be able to do that book. I had to be able to have a track record where I could convince the publisher that I was capable of doing that,
Mm.
and it would be, potentially one that would sell. And in fact, that has actually been one of the most long sellers of all of them. So it's a balancing act. But I think I think I've been quite lucky,
Do you
and I think
work every day on something? Do you plan your next book and like do you have a kind of schedule or are you more you put it all go really heavy in it for 3 months
well,
and then all
yeah, I mean, I've normally, I mean, I'm at a moment in one of those rare situations where I just finished a book which is coming out in the autumn, and I'm not working on a book at the moment. I'm trying to deliberately take my time before committing to something else. I have various things, ideas. I have various stuff where I've got material written, sort of early draft and things, but I'm trying to sort of take my time a bit and think about what to do next. But there's always something to do because apart from books, there's always articles, reviews, things like this. So There's always something on the go. When I've got a book and I've got a contract to deliver a book, then you have the challenges to make sure the other things don't crowd out the time.
Yeah.
So
So
in
you're
those
always
times,
prepped.
I try to be more disciplined there. I think what I typically try to do is I try to say the mornings for the book. You know,
Yeah.
whatever else is happening, try and make the morning for the book. Yeah.
That's good. Well, thanks for writing this book. I've read not all of your books, but quite a lot of them. And this one, I think, really gives something that we really needed. They all do, but I guess because I just read it, maybe I feel even closer to it. But I think it's, like you said, it's a book you needed to read, so you wrote it, and I think a lot of people probably want to read it. So thanks, and
Well,
thanks for
thank you.
talking to
Thank
me.
you very much.
It's been great.